Welcome, everyone. I'm really thrilled to have you all here at the 2025 Senior Honors Conference here at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. My name is Nicole Pangborn. I am the director of the IAPA Honors Program. I'm also a visiting lecturer here at the Watson Institute, and I'm a sociologist by training. I had the great honor as well of leading one of the two senior honors seminars this past fall, along with Professor Claudia Elliott. So that means I got to know this year's thesis cohort up close and get a real sneak peek on their work and their development from an 8-page proposal at the start of the fall term all the way to the massive thesis documents that they produced at the end of this process. And I really do mean massive, hundreds of pages, and in some cases a few more pages than we stipulated, but that's okay. So these senior theses, which we're all really excited to hear about today, are the product of over a year of sustained intellectual effort. To give you a sense of what this journey entailed, I'd like to just outline everything that these students had to go through to get to the point that they're all at right now. Over a year ago, in their junior year, they began to imagine the kinds of questions that they were curious to explore. Questions that reflect real, pressing social and political issues in the world. They took the initiative to go out and find faculty advisors who had the substantive or methodological expertise to guide them in answering their questions. And they crafted formal research proposals, marking their commitment to seeing this project through. Last summer, the summer before their senior year, these students were already deep into their work, reading up on the scholarly literature and policy debates, and considering how they might make a tiny contribution to what others in the world had already found out about their topic. Then, in the fall, they enrolled in the International Public Affairs Senior Honors Seminar. I led one section, and Professor Claudia Elliott led the other. In that seminar, students followed a disciplined weekly writing schedule, producing analytical memos, and staying on track to complete the first 2 chapters by December. And keep in mind that that is alongside all of their other commitments during their senior year, in the form of other classes, extracurriculars, campus speakers, conferences, and travel. We had, for example, Quinn Mai, who isn't here right now, one of the other thesis students. She was a leader in the Brown Ballet Company and was very busy in the fall preparing to perform the annual Nutcracker Ballet on campus. Charlie Adams here was producing climate podcasts for the Public's radio and crafting a full-length documentary during this process. Mia Hamilton was likely going to choir practice for hours and hours every week, and I just happily got invited to that senior recital. And the list could go on and on and on. The point is that these are ambitious young people. And so you can just imagine how each of them wanted to get everything they could out of their senior year, while also making steady, incremental progress on their thesis work. And not only did they each individually make progress during our weekly seminar where I got to know these students, many of these students, but they helped each other make progress as well. These students became thoughtful readers of their classmates' drafts, learning the generous act of providing close, constructive feedback on each other's work, and genuinely helping their peers improve their writing. Throughout this time, they met regularly with their faculty advisors and readers, many of whom are here today. These faculty members offered their expertise, mentorship, and steady guidance to our thesis students, and were instrumental in helping our students refine their research questions, plan their research design, and strategize about their data collection. I'd love to just briefly pause and acknowledge all of the time and energy that our faculty advisors and readers put into our seniors. We're all so grateful for your generosity and for your dedication to these excellent students. I'd love to give them a quick round of applause. Now, after the sort of structure of the fall semester, these students were launched into the winter and this past spring with much more independence. They were faced with the sometimes daunting task of finishing their data collection, rounding up folks to interview, diving deep into the archives, reading old primary sources to build their case studies, and in some cases, processing and cleaning and analyzing quantitative data. I think it's important to note here that this kind of work, sustained, self-directed, often solitary, requires an enormous amount of personal drive. These students were dedicated enough, got enough internal satisfaction from the process, that they kept at it on their own. They lived and breathed their projects. In one example, I remember talking to Peter just before winter break and hearing him tell me how absolutely thrilled he was to just have the uninterrupted time to be alone with his thoughts and to dive into the depths of his quantitative data about global oil production and consumption trends. Or Tabitha, I don't see her in the room right now, but she spent hours and hours trying to recruit migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong, navigating complex logistical and ethical challenges along the way. I also heard word from one of Charlie's roommates, who may be here today, I don't see him though either, that he was simply constantly reading and writing and talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, nonstop, day and night. Slight variations of these examples reflect the experiences of all of our senior honors students. They stayed committed to questions that really don't have easy answers, even when they had to adjust their approach on the fly. To, for example, find a handful of new interviewees who could provide a perspective that was emerging as an important one, or to dive deep into an extra historical case that turned out to be essential. They learned how to move swiftly back and forth between abstract academic theories and the real empirical data that was emerging from the world around them. And at some point along this journey, often quietly, sometimes without even realizing it, these students crossed a threshold. They made the transition from consumers of knowledge to producers of knowledge. And I sort of feel like that's crossing a point of no return, really. These students are now experts in their thesis topics. They know these topics more deeply and intimately than anyone else here in the room. They're the ones who are teaching us now, their advisors, peers, family, and friends. And to our thesis students, now that you've made that leap, there's really no going back. You'll carry that authority with you wherever you go next. I hope that the confidence from what you've achieved this year will always bring you strength. And so now, enough from me. Let's hear from these experts. Some quick logistical notes. So what'll happen is that we'll have 4 panels of student presenters. Students on each panel will come up here and present for 10 minutes on their thesis topics. The panels will be moderated by some of our faculty here today. And they'll engage you all, the audience, in a Q&A after all 4 or 3 presenters are done. So just keep in mind, write your questions down if you have them as the students are talking, and get ready to ask them later. So we'll have 2 panels this morning, as you can see on the schedule. We'll briefly break for lunch in between those 2 panels, and then we'll come back and do the second 2 panels in the afternoon. And we'll also have some more panels tomorrow and a celebratory reception at the end of the day tomorrow. So I hope many of you will join us then as well. And with that, I am delighted to introduce Professor Ray, who will be our first faculty moderator. I'd love to call him up to moderate our first panel, Governing Natural Resources, Challenges to the Renewable Energy Transition.
Thank you, Anita. Good morning, everybody. You're not here to see me or to hear from me, so I'm going to be brief in my opening remarks. We want to showcase the people who really know what they're talking about. But just by way of introduction, my name is Chris Ray, and I'm Assistant Professor of Sociology and International Public Affairs here at Brown. I had the honor of advising one of the 4 theses here that's presenting this morning. So I won't tell you which, but it's clearly the best of the 4. No, of course, that's not true. The point is exactly what Dr. Pangborn was just saying, that these 4 pieces of work are incredible. And it's a great honor as a scholar of environmental politics and policy myself to watch what is very likely the next sort of generation of scholars of these themes do the incredible work they did and share it with you here today. The panel's title is Governing Natural Resources, Challenges to the Renewable Energy Transition. It could just as well be simply titled Energy Politics. And there's a lot of different definitions of politics that we could use, but certainly one of them is just about who wins and who loses and how and why, right? And there are very few things more fraught and challenging than the politics of who wins and who loses with energy, right? Which drives all of our lives at all times. So in different ways, in different capacities, each of these four theses grapple with not just politics, but politics with the distribution and allocation of one of the most fraught and essential commodities or entities that exist and structures our lives. So with that by way of introduction, I would love to turn it over to the students. Our first presentation is going to be Peter Edelstein, From Dependence to Dominance, How the Shale Revolution Rewired U.S. Foreign Policy in the Persian Gulf. And it's a remarkable piece of work. So Peter, I turn it over to you. Peter, I'll let you know when you've got how your time is different with these ones. Thank you. Got it.
Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Edelstein. Today, I'll be presenting From Dependence to Dominance, How the Shale Revolution Rewired U.S. Foreign Policy in the Persian Gulf. This research was informed by my interest in how critical resources shape patterns of competition and conflict in a contemporary global order that's been really increasingly defined by protectionism, economic nationalism, and general fragmentation of the global economy. So at the core of my research question lies this general inquiry into how shifts in national resource endowments change foreign policies and mechanisms of conflict in interstate competition, and the 2007 shale oil revolution, in which breakthroughs in hydraulic fracturing transformed the U.S. from an historical net importer of oil to the world's leading producer of oil by 2019, offers a really salient lens to explore this question. Throughout my research, U.S. Energy independence functions as my explanatory variable or my independent variable, and ensuing foreign policy in the Persian Gulf as my dependent variable. It really requires three areas of inquiry specifically. The first one is really quantifying the extent of energy independence. So to what degree is the U.S. economy insulated from potential supply shocks, especially emanating from the Persian Gulf? The second area is looking at if increasing energy independence really erodes strategic rationale for military entanglements and a sustained military footprint in the region, and if so, what new mechanisms of conflict are emerging. And then the third one is kind of that broader geopolitical question of how does this really drastic increase in energy sovereignty reshape a level of geopolitical leverage within global energy markets, again, with a specific focus in the Persian Gulf region. The significance of research. Firstly, I was just drawn to oil because it's really the leading conflict commodity since 1973. Nearly half of interstate wars have involved oil supplies. It's the most valuable traded commodity on the global market, 6 times more over than the next closest commodity, and it has no scalable substitute. Just briefly, pre-shale, oil was a real source of insecurity for the United States. Between 1973 and 2000, we were dependent on anywhere from 30 to 70% of our oil on OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, an oligopoly of the major oil producers that are largely based in the Persian Gulf states. Basically, high dependence on OPEC oil left us vulnerable to supply shocks, which has historically triggered inflation, depressed GDP, and even influenced presidential outcomes. As we were dependent on Gulf oil, basically we adopted a militarized energy security in which we used economic and military aid as well as direct military intervention in the region to secure a steady and affordable access to oil supply. Post-shale, quickly, as we see energy independence grow, it makes this topic of exploring how a potential source of insecurity can be transformed into a tool of leverage really rich for exploration. In terms of the intellectual context, basically I'm drawing on 4 theories of international relations. Quickly, offensive realism, which sees resource dependence as a source of vulnerability and thus a source of conflict in an anarchic international system. Liberalism, which sees interdependence raise the cost of conflict and thus foster peace. Trade expectations theory, which bridges those 2 theories by saying that actually conflict and resource interdependence depends on our future expectations of access to said resources. And then lastly, neo-mercantilism, which frames states as geoeconomic actors who see commodities not just as from an economic lens, but also as tools of national power. That all gets me to my original contribution, which is called resource realignment theory. It fuses insights from those 4 theories to basically explain how these shifts in national energy endowments can shape foreign policy patterns or foreign policy strategies and alliance patterns. It's more than 2 mechanisms: strategic resource sovereignty, which quickly says that as states become more, as they gain sovereignty in a certain resource or in an energy resource, their incentives to safeguard the stability of the market of that resource decline, and they adopt more unilateral policies that are narrowly focused on achieving state interests. And then the second mechanism is market rebalancing and rivalry, which says that shifts in these endowments displace old rivalries and form new ones. Quickly, my research design, I used a nested mixed methods research design in which quantitative, time series, and multivariate regression analysis focused on trends in the global market, both from an export and import rate to actual oil prices, really trying to assess how much OPEC's pricing power decreased and how economically insulated the US economy became. Qualitative, I chose 5 cases that were bifurcated by the shale revolution to see what US foreign policy looks like when we're energy dependent and what it looks like when we're energy independent. And my data sources for my quantitative work, I mostly relied on the EIA, FRED, the Federal Reserve Economic Database, the Energy Institute, and then my qualitative work. I did a lot of archival research from the FRUS archives, as well as congressional research reports, and then a whole swath of presidential libraries. So my key findings, both from a quantitative standpoint, so here, this is one graph that kind of shows that structural change in the global oil market and the real exponential rise in US domestic production. Then secondly, the oil market became much more volatile after the shale revolution because of shale's rapid and flexible production models. Shale producers have the ability to respond quickly to supply and demand mismatches, which made the market more adaptable, but also equally volatile as we see this real big spike on beginning around 2008. And then really importantly, at the core of my research is we're focusing on decentralized pricing power and how pre-shale we see how there's this inverse relationship between Brent and WTI prices, which are the benchmarks of oil prices, and OPEC production. But post-shale, basically, OPEC has lost the ability to unilaterally dictate the prices of oil benchmarks. And then concerning my qualitative findings, I really find this massive transformation from militarized energy independence to coercive economic statecraft. When the independent variable of energy independence is limited, we see the US adopt tools of hard power to sustain our energy our energy needs. But as we transition to become more energy autonomous, in fact, Washington's policy adopts a much more unilateral kind of stance and is much more coercive towards both former adversaries and allies alike. Basically, conclusions and implications. So the shale revolution, it dramatically altered our energy profile. It increased production. We had an added level of economic insulation, but this economic insulation was only partial because US gasoline prices still remain tied to the international benchmark and not the domestic benchmark. So basically, the conclusion there is that while we're less kind of at the whims of OPEC's production policies, we're not completely energy independent because we're still susceptible to global market volatility. And then there's been this massive shift from military interventions to really that relied on multilateral efforts with both Gulf states and NATO states to really policies that were more narrowly tailored to US interests and relied on coercive economic statecraft. Then going back to my resource realignment contributions, strategic resource sovereignty, basically saying how throughout my case studies, we see that when energy independence was low, our actions aligned with stabilizing global market stability. And so that aligned our interest with our allies, and it basically kind of constrained our foreign policy options towards military ones. Whereas post-shale, now that we don't have as much interest in stabilizing the market, our interests are much more unilateral and we don't rely on military action, but more so kind of individual economic coercion. And then market rebalancing and rivalry, these shifts are really altering alliance structures in the global energy landscape as we see the formation of OPEC Plus, and which includes Russia in the OPEC oligopoly. Sorry, I'm out of time. And how we're seeing this real erosion of energy institutions such as the IEA and the US kind of diminishing participation in that institution, as well as US withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord. Contemporary implications, I've kind of hit on them, but I'm out of time. So before I end, I just want to really profusely thank my thesis advisors, Aditi Sahasrabudhe and Professor Nitsan Shorev, whose help and guidance and support throughout this entire process really made this project possible. Thank you all very much.
We should add also that, and please come in. Yes, there's seats in the front here. There's some seats down here. File in. Don't be shy. I should add that in addition to all of the incredible challenges of doing the work that these students did, is the even perhaps more daunting challenge of summarizing a year of work in 10 minutes. So well done, Peter, and good luck to the rest of you and the entire conference. Okay, next we have Emma Wang, Methane Markets and the Myth of Bridge Fuel, Reevaluating Natural Gas as a Strategy for Decarbonization. Emma? I won't start the timer.
Thank you. There we go. So, hi everyone, good morning. I'm Emma Huang, and I'll be presenting to you today Methane Markets and the Myth of Bridge Fuel, which is reevaluating natural gas as a strategy for decarbonization. That's a lot of words and some alliteration too, so I'll kind of scale it back for a bit. My thesis essentially examines the role of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, as a kind of transitional bridge fuel in the clean energy transition on kind of the two primary poles of one, the viability of gas as a decarbonization strategy, and two, also examining how the US, as the leading global exporter in gas, has kind of accounted for environmental concerns while engaging in kind of these market opportunities. And so to kind of provide a bit more of context here also, gas has kind of been touted as the most climate friendly of the fossil fuels. So what that means is that gas, when burned, is the least carbon emissive or greenhouse gas emissive compared to other fossil fuel options like oil and coal. And so therefore, some scholars and lots of industry experts and policymakers have kind of promoted gas to be this kind of bridge fuel. And what that kind of essentially means is that in the context of trying to scale towards a more cleaner energy system where we rely more so on renewable energy sources, as we scale renewable energy sources to kind of meet current demand, we rely on those climate-friendly fossil fuel option, which is gas. So that's why gas is a bridge fuel. And what has made that more so possible is the rise of LNG technology. So this idea that we can now liquefy gas into a liquid form. It's now 1/600th the volume of gas in its gaseous state. And so therefore it can also be now globally transported, whereas gas traditionally is transported underground in like a pipeline system. Now we can have a global export system. And so the US has really been capitalizing the opportunity. Peter really set me up really great here by mentioning this shale revolution. That is what has allowed the US to kind of tap into its reserves and take advantage of this. And so given all this context, it kind of sets up well for this research puzzle here. So now given what we know about increasing gas demand and this touted bridge fuel theory, my questions really were, under what conditions has natural gas been recognized as a tool for decarbonization, and is it a viable strategy? And then for the US specifically, how is the regulatory environment for liquefied natural gas accounted for the strategy and positioning amidst a growing market? And so my study really kind of fills in the gap in energy policy literature on two main stakes. One, this touted bridge fuel theory, and two, liquefied natural gas literature in general, which has seen an uptick over the past decade as the US has started exporting gas in 2016. And so there is a growing market opportunity of LNG and this momentum of gas as a bridge fuel. But there are also scholars who challenge the LNG production can actually be counteractive to this emissions reductions idea due to the risk of methane leakage. So like I said, while gas is the least carbon intensive when burned, is the most carbon intensive in its composition. So if gas leaks along the way of any kind of point of the life cycle of extraction to distribution and production, that kind of counteracts the whole thesis that gas is cleaner as a fossil fuel. And so overall, the key debate here is, can methane leakage be controlled properly if this is to work? And so my study kind of really examines this tension in this growing market opportunity with respect to methane leakage in general. And so to kind of really contextualize this, my research design kind of consists of a mixed methods approach. I primarily had a case study on the Sabine Pass Terminal, and I also did an emissions analysis using the Rocky Mountain Institute's OCI plus index. And so my case study really focused on the Sabine Pass Terminal. This is the first liquefaction terminal in the United States. It's in Cameron Parish, Louisiana. It started exporting in 2016, and it's owned by the private energy company Cheniere. And so to kind of really dive in on this, I did a process tracing method looking at regulatory frameworks of Sabine Pass and whatever kind of Cheniere had to adhere to over a 2010 to 2023 timeline. The primary kind of source of my work here was kind of using the Department of Energy's archival database over this time period. And on the emissions side, my awesome advisor, Debbie Gordon, is an affiliate of the Rocky Mountain Institute, which has a really robust tool called the Oil Climate Index plus Gas. I primarily use the OCI's supply chain emissions database to kind of have my own emissions estimates and kind of trace alongside my case study to kind of compare my own estimates as compared to what Cheniere self-reports actually annually in their investor presentations every year since 2021. I also primarily use the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission e-library. Again, a lot of words, but the FERC. The FERC and the DOE had a lot of archival databases that I kind of drew upon for my analysis. And so to kind of extract here one of the key findings, especially in regards to emissions analysis, is I did a kind of a cross comparison of what I estimate to be Sabine Pass's emissions leakage, upstream leakage compared to what Cheniere reports. And so to kind of characterize what upstream and midstream mean, this basically means any leakage that has happened up from the point of extraction at the physical gas site up until when it reaches Sabine. So these three kind of cases here that are in the graph, Gulf of Mexico, the Permian Basin, and Texas Eagle Ford are three gas extraction sites. And that kind of, from there to Sabine, I kind of estimated the emissions leakage from there compared to what Sabine reported themselves. And the overall finding was that since 2021, when Cheniere has started self-reporting their emissions, my estimates are 4 to 10 times higher in that range. So that kind of really shows there's a gap here. There's a lack of transparency on what the self-report really means, and also a lack of understanding for where emissions are being tracked throughout the whole life cycle of gas. And to kind of bring this back into context a bit more with the case study overall, I had three main key takeaways from the study. that one, natural gas is conditionally framed as a decarbonization tool in policy. And two, the Sabine Pass case really highlights this fragmented and opaque landscape of US LNG regulation, especially regarding emissions. And yes, there have been regulatory developments between 2010 even up to 2024 that reveal a slow but steadily increasing recognition of life cycle emissions in LNG policy. This kind of really took place when in 2018, Cheniere had a scare. They had a crazy methane leak out of Sabine Pass, and that kind of really catalyzed some efforts to start including emissions regulations in the policy frameworks. And so my study has a few key kind of implications on the empirical or practical side of things. It is a comprehensive kind of overview of the landscape of US LNG policy in the United States, starting with the oldest and first LNG liquefaction terminal, Sabine Pass. But it also really calls for the consideration of life cycle emissions when implementing policy. Again, it sits at the kind of bridge fuel debate and kind of really sits at this tension of ideas of market-driven expansion. Again, the US has now tapped into their shale reserves versus kind of also keeping a track for climate accountability. And I think what really validates the study is here one of the initiatives in progress. The Department of Energy has released and starting in late 2023 and now through 2024 has been working on an MMRV framework, which stands for Measurement, Monitoring, Reporting, and Verification, which is a dedicated policy framework to any stakeholders and producers of LNG to kind of figure out how to best track their emissions. And so I guess I'll leave you here with this lovely map, which is kind of showing where Sabine Pass exports their gas to globally. Like I mentioned before, the United States is the world's leading exporter of gas, and Sabine Pass itself contributes 33% of that export. And so we see here the kind of gas gets exported pretty much everywhere. But overall, what really kind of my thesis studies is that it really calls for there to be an accountability towards tracking methane leakage in gas. In order for gas to remain this contested bridge fuel, methane leakage must be accounted for, and also kind of calls for a more critical approach to policy frameworks, which we're trying to see now in MMRV if it happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Next, we have Lena Hansen presenting Locating Sustainable Extraction, a comparative study of lithium in Jujuy, forgive me for mispronouncing that perhaps, but you can correct me, Argentina, and Nevada in the United States. Thank you very much. Lena?
Sorry, thank you. Okay, perfect. Hi, everybody. My name is Lena Hansen, and I wrote my thesis on locating sustainable extraction through a comparative study of lithium in Jujuy, Argentina, and Nevada, USA. And I first became really interested in this topic when I was introduced to the transition mineral paradox. And it's a paradox that occurs as we have an energy transition that looks to have a sustainable future, yet it is dependent on minerals that are inherently extracted in unsustainable ways. And these minerals are called transition minerals in the literature primarily because they are required in huge quantities to sustain the technologies of the energy transition, meaning electric vehicles, renewable energy sources such as wind and solar, and large-scale energy storage systems. And these transition minerals include nickel, copper, cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements. And I wanted to look at these transition minerals because they're linked to human rights violations across the world and huge amounts of ecological harm. And this felt like a huge issue that doesn't get talked about enough, where the very materials required to transition are just as unsustainable, one could argue, than the ones we're trying to avoid, such as fossil fuels and carbon-based energy sources. And These abuses are well documented across the world, from the Democratic Republic of Congo and the exploitative labor and violence that occurs in cobalt mining there, to nickel smelting in Indonesia, where we see huge amounts of ecological harm and inequality, to the lithium fields of South America in the Lithium Triangle, where we see huge amounts of water being used and indigenous rights being violated. So this came up to me as a huge problem, and one that is shared globally. As the Secretary General of the United Nations says, as we shape how we repower our societies and economies, we cannot replace one dirty, exploitative, extractive industry with another dirty, exploitative, extractive industry. The race to net zero cannot trample over the poor. And so this was really the significance that was driving my interest in this study. And I started to think about how dislocated we are as a society in our globalized networks of trade. And so I started to think about geography and which geographies are bearing the costs and which geographies and people and communities are benefiting from those costs. And this brought me to the question of sustainability and locale. And does it matter where we produce things? Does it matter where we extract them from and where they become final products? And so I asked the question, to what extent does the locale of extraction impact sustainability? More specifically, to what extent do dynamics of extraction change when a commodity is extracted in the same locale it is consumed? So I was looking at the lengthening of global supply chains and how we are so dislocated from the sites of consumption in wealthy countries that are consuming electric vehicles, renewable energy technologies, and the sites of extraction, which are having to deal with these outsized ecological burdens. And so that's what I wanted to look at. And my thesis primarily dealt with corporate-free models and theories of uneven development to investigate this idea of sustainability and if it truly works. And I was provided with the great opportunity to investigate this as the US and the EU looked to onshore supply chains of critical minerals, one of them being lithium. So I looked at lithium because it is one of the most fastest growing mineral in demand. It's also super reactive and geographically abundant. So it's found in nearly every continent on Earth. And you can extract it in a variety of different ways. So it provided a really interesting opportunity to investigate this locale question. And I used two case studies to really answer this question. One of them was Jujuy province in Argentina. It's located in the northwestern part of Argentina and borders Chile and Bolivia. It's part of the Lithium Triangle, which is a vast amount of the world's reserves that are held in subterranean brines. And I wanted to look at it because it gets to this question of export-driven markets and foreign investment-led development models versus my other case study, which is Nevada, USA, which is focused on providing for domestic markets in the United States. And developing a lithium loop is the idea that they're promoting there, where from extraction to production to consumption, it's all occurring in the same region, where you have Tesla factories and automotive industries that are using those same lithium-ion batteries within miles of where the lithium is extracted from the ground. So I was looking at these two cases, and they provided a great opportunity for this. While Nevada's lithium is a little bit more nascent and Jujuy's is a little bit more developed, I collected data through key informant interviews, as well as primary and secondary document analysis with environmental advocates, tribal members, regulators. And then I analyzed the data through a framework through which I evaluate sustainability. And I use this 3-pillar model that much of the sustainability literature builds upon, where you can't evaluate sustainability without looking at all three. And I analyzed them through both quantitative and qualitative metrics, looking at how much water is used in each circumstance, looking at the governance structures, as well as the energy that's used in each operation. And so this framework basically created the foundation for my study, where I was able to evaluate the relative sustainability of these operations and also the overall longevity of these operations, finding that if environmental, social, and economic sustainability is not considered, the long-term viability of the operation continuing was in jeopardy. So there's some key findings from my study. The first being that environmental sustainability does improve in contexts where the supply chains can be conceptualized and acted out within the same region. And part of this Part of this is because of regulation, which was one of the biggest things I found. Of that regulation did have the biggest impact on sustainability in terms of water governance, permitting processes, and the incentive for renewable energy integration into the extraction process. And as opposed to HUHI, where there were higher barriers to entry with these concepts. The second is that economic sustainability also improved in the Nevada context as compared to HUHI. This was primarily due to a more beneficial fiscal structure for communities located around extraction and mining royalties being leveraged, whereas the HUHI context wants to incentivize foreign investment. Mining royalties were not raised, and they also struggled with further value chain development because of the existing industries and the raw export model. Social sustainability also was inconclusive between the two cases. We found that in both cases, social sustainability was threatened by extractive activity, limited by flaws in community consultation, indigenous rights, and expedited project development in both regions. Moving towards the implications and conclusions, there are many, but the main ones that I have were in terms of theory. This project built upon theories of extractivism, which present extraction and sustainability as diametrically opposed. Extractivism is framed by the raw export of materials from one country to another country and development models that center around foreign investment and exporting raw materials. And so this study found that actually extraction and sustainability are not diametrically opposed, but rather where we're doing it and how we're doing it is important. The second thing that this study built upon was core periphery models. I looked at a traditionally core country, the United States, and then a traditionally periphery country, Argentina, and how these core periphery dynamics evolved within these countries. And I found that, in fact, core periphery dynamics can persist within nations as in addition to across nations and within regions. I found this through Nevada having a big rural-urban divide emerging, as well as HUHI, where urban centers had more consolidated wealth and benefits from these activities. And then the security sustainability nexus is an idea promoted by Professor Theo Francos of Providence College, which basically justifies the onshoring movement in the EU and the US at the intersection of security, energy security, and sustainability. And I investigated the sustainability aspect of this, finding that, yeah, in fact, the United States and the EU countries have better availability to promote these sustainability practices. In terms of policy, I'll go through it swiftly, but the domestic sourcing of these minerals should be promoted, and if it's possible, should be done. The second is that regulation, and this might be the biggest takeaway from this, is that regulation does have real impacts on sustainability, and regulators should wield that power with consideration and concern. And then that supply chains can be developed and thoughtfully planned, and we have the power to do so. And also that the long-term operational viability is dependent on sustainability, even if you're not caring about sustainability. If you want a mine to stay open for a long time, all these factors need to be considered. And then for future research, it's a super contemporary issue. It's evolved as I started writing it a year ago. And so I would love to see longitudinal studies with these same case studies I've looked at to see how these industries develop and change. As well as I mentioned a lot of innovative technology within my thesis, such as direct lithium extraction and the co-location of geothermal energy and produced water from oil and gas, as well as battery recycling for lithium. But I'll leave you all with this. As we consider how we develop and we consider sustainability, we need to think about where it is occurring, how it is occurring, and who's bearing the costs. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. Super important lessons for all of us to consider. Last but certainly not least, we have Charlie Adams, Ghosts in the Green Machine, Escaping the Dunkelflaute of National Climate Politics in the U.S. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you're having a good day. Thank you for being here. This guy's real alleys. All right. Well, I'd like to start by thanking my friends and family who are here today. My family came down from Boston, my family came up from Virginia, and my friends who have put up with me speaking about the IRA incessantly for the past year. I am so grateful for your support and encouragement, and also to my advisor, who you may have guessed who it might be. With that being said, I'll get right into it. For decades, the United States has failed to enact a comprehensive national climate policy. This is despite a clear scientific consensus on the urgent need for action. Climate activists have referred to this political failure as the Dunkelflaut, which refers a German term in the renewable energy sector to describe days where there is no sun, where there is no wind, similar to the day outside, and which literally translates to the dark doldrums. A pretty ominous and quirky and terrifying term to describe climate politics. And it's within this context that the IRA is, against all odds, born. The means to overcome the political Dunkelflaut causing U.S. climate policy inaction long remained elusive. That is until the historic passage of the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, or the IRA. Through tax incentives and direct federal investments, hundreds of billions of dollars were allocated to develop a clean energy economy and decarbonize carbon-intensive industries. If properly implemented, and that is a big if now, these measures will put the U.S. on the path to meeting global climate change commitments, which is very significant in and of itself. My thesis examines the political dynamics that enabled this breakthrough, and to begin, I will explain what exactly the IRA had to break through to succeed. Scholars have identified three fundamental factors that constrain climate policy in the United States. First, the rules and procedures of American climate policymaking institutions, which set the coalition size. As with any bill, pro-climate activists are required to assemble a simple majority in both the House and Senate, and also win the support of the president, passing numerous veto points throughout this process. And that's just if they want to pass it through reconciliation. If they really want to add the teeth and the sticks beyond just the carrots that can make decarbonization really happen, they often have taken the route of passing it through regular procedures, which require overcoming a 60-vote filibuster threshold in the Senate. So, given the often narrowly divided political composition of the United States Senate between Republicans and Democrats, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to reach that 60-vote threshold without bipartisan support. Whereas in the early 2000s, the Republican Party was more aligned with passing climate policy, its association with carbon-intensive firms and anti-regulatory think tanks, coupled with the rise of the Tea Party in the early 2000s, to crystallize opposition by the time serious rounds of climate policymaking came about. And that essentially cut the coalition pathway to reaching climate policy in half by making it solely rely on Democrats. Last but perhaps most important is the influence of carbon interests. They're not exclusive to the Republican Party. It's not just carbon-intensive firms influencing their agenda. They're also influencing Democrats. Democrats have a long history of ties to the industrial labor unions, and particularly brown dog Democrats, who are those who represent states and districts with significant concentrations of carbon industry, who are least insulated from the concerns of these labor organizations and the firms in their districts. My thesis centers right there in this distributive conflict waged by policy losers. I ask how in two carbon-intensive states, Michigan and Pennsylvania, that are represented by Democrats, and across two policymaking epochs, the cap-and-trade period in 2009-2010 and 2021-22 during the IRA, how climate activists are able to assemble a coalition of carbon-intensive labor and firms located in these states. So to begin, I want to explain. First, I'll start in with the cap-and-trade epoch. In Michigan, you have an alignment of labor during this first period in which the automotive industry labor sector is reeling from international economic decline. There's rising competitiveness concerns, and labor is really concerned about their jobs being taken away. And so they're very defensive of the competitiveness of the auto industry. Firms are similarly concerned about the competitiveness of their industry and essentially work within existing pro-climate business associations to weaken climate policy and maintain the status quo, while also working through outside opposition organizations to essentially destroy the bill. Additionally, utilities in Michigan, the labor organizations there were sort of divided on the issue, in which half the unions sort of saw this opportunity for growth alongside green industrial development, alongside the prioritization of clean electricity development and carbon capture, where the other half saw the withdrawal of coal and the decline of coal as being very problematic for their future. And that created this divide which Michigan senators were constrained by. Firms in the utility industry led the opposition against cap and trade. They were very fervent in their opposition, while they also worked within groups like the Edison Electric Institute. They weakened it through creating their own coalition called the Midwest Climate Coalition, in which they launched grassroots opposition, they launched advertising campaigns, and they directly lobbied senators. In Pennsylvania, you have a similar composition during the first epoch, in which steel, although steel was initially a very strong proponent of the labor force, a strong proponent of climate action, essentially the United Steelworkers saw this climate policy as being a boon to demand for steel by the development of clean energy, by the development of transmission lines, and by the development of electric vehicles. Firms, however, were very cost averse and did not want to have these risks influence their business model, which was very strained by competition from other international steel firms. In the coal and gas sector, you had labor, which was again divided on this question of whether green industrial policy or cap and trade rather would create new jobs in green employment, or whether it would take away those jobs in the coal sector. Firms during the Waxman Markey period led the opposition to climate policy. They were very strong in their opposition. They did not see a world in which they could survive the costs and sticks that cap and trade would impose. So, thinking about the creation of a policy window for the Inflation Reduction Act, I synthesize existing journalistic and scholarly accounts, and I add my own to find the following combination of historical political developments, conditions of possibility, and also exogenous shocks were important in creating this window in addition to policy learning. After the failure of cap and trade in 2009, following these industries constraining their senators and getting them to vote to signal their opposition to it, environmentalists had centered climate policy during a recent campaign cycle in 2021. And as Democrats took power, leadership sought to build a legislative agenda that was able to weave climate into the party's plans to address into deindustrialization that had previously been viewed largely as an economic and national security issue. By framing climate, then, in economic and security terms, advocates were able to capitalize on exogenous shocks such as the pandemic, which created economic insecurity, as well as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which created national security concerns and energy independence concerns. For example, in the IRA, they included tax credits that would incentivize domestic production of these resources of clean energy in areas formerly dominated by carbon-intensive industries. In addition to historical and exogenous events, this approach was the product of policy learning from the success of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which incidentally had passed right before the cap and trade policy was being considered in 2009. While it is most commonly discussed as a stimulus bill, many of the IRA's clean energy and climate provisions came from the American Recovery Act. Its grant programs, its tax credits, these were designed by brown dog Democrats in Michigan and Pennsylvania in collaboration with those carbon-intensive industries, and the Recovery Act showed how the tax credit toolkit of green industrial policy could be replicated in the case of the IRA to strategically shift anti-climate industrial interests in key states. So how did this play out in Michigan and Pennsylvania? Well, as you can see, there's a lot more green on the screen. Labor in the automotive sector saw this as a huge boon to the production of electric vehicles, and they worked with firms to develop policies that would incentivize consumer and production side for EVs. Utility labor similarly got on board with the recognition that coal is no longer going to be the future generating source for this industry. Firms also had transitioned their generation portfolios over time to become more open to clean energy. In Pennsylvania, you had a similar realignment where labor and firms in the steel sector similarly got on board with seeing steel as being domestic steel production is being incentivized by green industrial policy that would then lead to electric vehicles, clean energy projects, and transmission lines. Coal and gas labor also got on board with the similar recognition that coal was no longer going to be the future, the labor rather, and gas saw themselves as a potential decarbonizing ally. Firms remained staunch in their opposition, but their opposition was weakened by not having labor being as much aligned with themselves. So, three coalitional movements are very important to draw out in this final slide. First, green industrial policy advocates through the IRA were able to win support from industrial labor unions by providing plausible employment in the green economy. Second, they cleaved support from key firms by providing viable profit streams from green industrial development, and they did this by deploying subsidies, such as tax credits, which passed the reconciliation, rather than regulatory costs. Last, they diluted broader business association opposition, such as the Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers, by taking away these key firms. The implications of this are huge, are that green industrial policy can maybe be a unique, valuable tool for dealing with attributive conflict between labor and firms and overcoming these binds that previously restricted policy action. Second, subnational political economies are key to understanding and triggering climate action. You might notice I didn't mention Joe Manchin a singular time in this presentation, which is very uncommon for recounts of the IRA, but that's because I see him as being emblematic of this broader dynamic and not the sole case of its existence. And lastly, in the Q&A, I'm happy to take questions about how this pro-climate coalition may hold together under the Trump administration. Thanks.
Let's have one more round of applause for all 4 panelists, please. Anita has a very challenging job here. Thank you. All right. Well, I have some substantive questions that I could ask each of the panelists, but actually I think it would be much more fun if we got to hear from the audience. And so you may all have questions that you'd like to ask them. I'll hold some in reserve. But let's open it up to the floor so that anyone who would like to ask one of our 4 or multiple of the panelists a question has an opportunity to do so. I think we have mics that can move around the room. Yeah. Let's start. So we're gonna start on the other side. We have 2 across. Okay, yeah, here we go. I think right here with the yellow thermos, yeah.
Hi, I would love the answer to Charlie's question at the end of his slides.
He needed an extra minute. That was very skillfully done.
Yeah, happy to do it. Happy to ask myself questions in a sense. It's really interesting to watch. So each of these different industries has reacted differently to Republicans' attempts to now repeal the IRA. The automotive industry has taken the stance of advocating for a gradual rescindment of tax credits for EV production, sort of banking on the idea that EVs are going to become the vehicle of the future, that these economics are already in place, that the gears are already turning, and that they just need this sort of like spark to get things going. The utility industry has also been advocating for the maintenance of clean energy tax provisions, which are importantly technologically neutral, in the sense that there can be awarded not just to wind and solar, but to production sources that include, geothermal or even natural gas with carbon capture. And so it's really interesting to watch that happen because now Republicans are struggling to repeal those tax credits for industries that they're more closely aligned to. I would say that it's the most striking thing about watching sort of the aftermath of the IRA and now its repeal is how labor is fighting for a lot of these credits, but because Joe Manchin took out a lot of the labor protectionist provisions, there's less attachment to them. So, for example, there was going to be an additional tax credit for electric vehicles that would have given you thousands more dollars if the vehicle was produced by union workforces, but that was taken out. So I think that if there was more on the table for them to gain, that there would be more steadfast opposition. But honestly, there's not too much, it seems like, that could be done rhetorically or in terms of real political power to influence this administration and its goals from the climate side.
I think there was another question over here.
Yeah, I have a question for Peter. I'm curious how you see the mineral deal in Ukraine in the context of your research, specifically thinking about unilateral American action abroad, right? But at the same time, you could also see that as sort of a retconning of old energy frameworks where we're building a security apparatus around dependence on extraction in another country.
No, I think that's a really, really interesting question. Historically, or I guess in the second half of the 20th century, we saw the US and European states in general really move in lockstep together. So like for the 1973 OPEC embargo, the US and Europe were equally subject to getting cut off of oil supplies. And then in the 1990 Gulf War, for example, the US and a lot of NATO states equally participated in that coalition military response to drive out Iraq from Kuwait and to prevent Iraqi invasion of Saudi Arabia. But now post-shale, and especially after the 2014 to 2016 price wars, in which OPEC initially tried to flood the market to drive out non-OPEC supply, there's been this sort of reorientation of global markets in which Europe has now, and the instance you provided is a good example, but basically I look at Ukraine and general European states as kind of this like geopolitical swing player, because technically they're still our allies, but the US, especially in the energy arena, we're treating them sort of similar as adversaries, as we're kind of sending implicit threats that if they don't, sign long-term contracts to buy US oil, they're going to be subject to the same treatment as we would kind of fashion our energy diplomacy towards states like Saudi Arabia or even Iran. So now you see it's almost this real inflection points where Ukraine and the EU is doing some serious inward reflection and assessing to which kind of spheres of energy production can they rely on for steady and affordable access for the long term. And the question, I don't know the question. Well, I guess we'll have to see, but I think it's really an interesting area to explore going forward.
Thank you so much, everyone. I have two questions, one for Emma and one for Charlie. So my first question for Emma was, you mentioned that the regulatory framework for LNGs are quite opaque and fragmented. So would you say that you're arguing for a federal-based solution, or do you think that a state-based solution is also a viable option, given that not every state is an LNG exporting state? And for Charlie, I'd love to pick your brain on whether you think this is a fair comparison between the Waxman, I think it's Waxman-Markey bill, and the IRA, given that one is like an economic investment-based solution and the other one would have passed, or I guess would have implemented strict regulations or strict mandates on emissions. So do you think that the realignment you're seeing is just differing reactions, or do you think that there's an actual shift in the way that these or is there an actual shift in the way that these, I think you mentioned labor and firms, do you think that there's like a shift in the way that they actually view climate change, or if they're like in support of climate change solutions?
Okay, I'll take a stab. Thank you for the question. I think what ultimately I did argue was that whatever regardless of the frameworks that are happening, that emissions methane, like kind of emissions should be the main consideration in policy frameworks. I think I kind of glossed over this a bit in the presentation due to time, but the kind of major like players in regulation are kind of like FERC and the DOE. The DOE kind of authorizes like exports, so kind of physically taking the gas out, versus the FERC kind of regulates operations day to day. So the two together are kind of two major players. There are kind of state players, right? So Sabine has to kind of adhere to like Louisiana's kind of policies, et cetera. I think, but to mostly kind of answer your question of what I was kind of arguing was more so just to kind of just really hammer that emissions is kind of like a kind of a main data point that should be considered regardless, because there's no such kind of consideration for that in current frameworks is what I was ultimately saying. But yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Marcos, for the question. I'm very grateful because this is like a key part of my argument that I might have breezed over. The realignment in and of itself is what is important. I think like having the labor and firms shift from opposition and division, working through outside advocacy groups, launching their own campaigns, and essentially working to maintain the status quo, and shifting from that to actively supporting is really the important movement. The dynamics that influence that can be very diverse, and I think in a lot of cases they are. I specifically call attention to the tools of green industrial policy, which is essentially state intervention into the economy to support the growth of green industries. And that's done in this case through the deployment of tax credits, of subsidies, of direct federal expenditures to build new, cleaner forms of factories and vehicles and energy generation sources. And so I think absolutely what you're saying, the difference between a regulatory cost or stick versus a carrot accompanying green industrial policy is crucial to understanding that shift. And in some ways, it is very simple in that sense. Like, they're not getting punished. And so, of course, they like it, and they're getting lots of money. And then there's also other dynamics, such as subnational policies landscapes that are influencing these things. You know, like in Michigan, the utility industry was also influenced to move because they had passed an intervening period between Waxman-Markey and the Inflation Reduction Act policies that incentivize the development of clean energy and clean electricity, and moved Michigan from being one of the most coal-dependent states for their electricity to shifting towards more renewable and also questionably renewable sources of energy like natural gas. So there's a number of factors there. One of the things that was interesting that I tried to control for across these epics is that the senators one of the senators serving in Michigan, Debbie Stabenow, and one of the senators serving in Pennsylvania, Bob Casey, both served continuously across that period. And so I was able to sort of rule out some of the more politico understandings of it as an individual being the one that's making this decision, and focus more on that arrangement.
Right here, yeah. Oh. Go ahead.
Okay. Ready? Okay. First of all, good work to all four of you. Very, very interesting projects. My question is for Lena. Lena, I understand your argument that regulation and location have an effect on sustainability. So I understand that piece of the argument. But I also, I'm just thinking of the socio-political context of your two cases as being so different, Jujuy, Argentina, and Nevada. So I wonder, did you consider that, or do you have something to say about that, the context within which lithium is produced and extracted? Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for the question. The context is important, and I think that that's what was at the basis of that, where it's the context in which you're producing is important, but I think you actually do see some really interesting similarities between Nevada and Jujuy in terms of context, where you have the lithium being extracted from fairly rural, very remote regions, often located very close to tribal land or land that was not deemed valuable by the government. We have, like in the United States, we have federally owned lands that that anyone can prospect on, and in Jujuy it's a similar context. In terms of like colonial legacies and the historical backing there, that's tied in, I think, with the arguments about extractivist paradigms and the idea that it's a culture that relies upon materials being exported and it being inherently exploitative. And that was the dichotomy that I wanted to look at. And I also found it very interesting that in terms of like the social sustainability aspect, that a lot of those things actually carry through with extractive activity. That even if there's not the context of historical colonialism in a region such as Nevada, you still see that there's marginalized groups that are increasingly marginalized by the occurrence of extractive activity, like in Thacker Pass in Nevada and with Rhyolite Ridge, which are two big lithium projects that are emerging right now. There was no community consultation. It was pushed through in 2020 without considering any of the indigenous groups that are in that region and that have burial grounds that were on the exact same sites that these things are occurring. And so I think in some ways, like, context does matter, but there was another condition that emerged that yes, context matters, and yes, historical legacies matter, but these issues will emerge no matter where extractive activity is happening. Did I answer your question? Okay.
There was a question, right here in the middle.
Oh, congratulations, California. This is a more general.
There's a mic coming for you so we can all hear you clearly.
Thank you. Congratulations, you all. This is a more general question, but like your panel is about governing natural resources, and some of you touched on this in your presentation, but what was, when deciding on a thesis, how did you come to these projects, and like what was your big driving factor or motivation?
Tremendous question. Why don't we just start with Peter and move down the yeah. Sure. We have, just as an FYI, we have about 3 minutes left, so try to keep your answers fairly concise.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Elliot. Like I kind of mentioned in my presentation, I'm fascinated by conflict, interstate conflict, and specifically how resources drive that conflict or may prevent that conflict. I surveyed all sorts of possibilities and kind of landed on oil because I've realized that it has been at the nexus of so many different types of interstate competitions. And then in order to, I mean, just like oil and conflict is obviously two inherently broad of a question. So I tried to look at one specific instance or one development in which there was some sort of material change in the global oil market with preference for something related to the United States because I'm fascinated by American politics. And so the 2007 shale revolution satisfied both of those criteria. And then through a lot of reflection and research, it kind of basically landed on the research question that I wrapped up.
I also had to say, I think it's kind of just through exploration through different IAPA coursework. I think I kind of most pointedly think about my topic first to when I took a junior seminar, actually the same seminar I met Lena in, but I think you fell in love with your topic too. Mm-hmm. But it was called Climate Change, Money and Power. I think it kind of really studied climate kind of drivers, but also with capitalism, which I think you kind of get undertones of in my presentation. But overall, I just kind of want to understand the kind of global and more so United States kind of like energy system and how that works. So I kind of picked gas and happened to get matched with an awesome advisor, Debbie Gordon, who's a subject matter expert. So that was kind of how I got into it through kind of coursework and just really wanting to understand our energy system and where we're currently going.
Yeah, thank you, Elliot. I think I've focused so much on my time in the IAPA department on development and development theory. And I think it's really interesting to see how that shifts in very contemporary contexts and also question these ideas of sustainability or equity and global equality and what our future is going to hold. So I kind of landed on lithium and this whole topic through the intersection of all my interests of climate and also development and just interrogating our accepted notions.
I grew up outside DC, so I've been going to the climate marches for most of my life, and it's always optimistic and somewhat depressing to kind of come home from those because you see how many people care about these issues, and then you see what ends up happening in Congress. And so trying to understand that disconnect has been a big part of my life. And I think like just the contemporary importance of the Inflation Reduction Act, it was a neat way to explore that. I also got to intern in the Senate for Sheldon Whitehouse, our senator here. And so right after the IRA passed, I was around lots of the staffers and other folks who made that bill happen. So just having coffee chats with them and hearing their stories was really fascinating and inspired me to do this.
Thank you. Before we adjourn, I just want to take moderator privilege to say two things very briefly. So the first is that this is a tremendous celebration of these students' work. And a funny feature of academic work is that you put a tremendous amount of work into things behind the scenes for, in this case, over a year. And then you have just a very brief moment to share it with the world, right? And so please take time to celebrate with these students, both now, but also more broadly, the incredible achievement that they've reached. And I also just want to end by saying, giving a huge thank you to Anita Nestor and Dr. Nicole Pangborn for organizing this conference, which was a tremendous amount of work too. So thank you, everybody. We'll have a 5-minute break.
We're going to take a brief stretch break, only a couple of minutes before we transition to the next panel. But I did just want to announce, you'll see that all of you panelists have an honors cord in front of you. That is yours to take home and to mark your achievement. Wear it proudly at graduation. And fantastic job, folks. So we'll see you in a couple of minutes after we transition.